Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign chairman, this month in New York. Hilary Swift for The New York Times, Washington. President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul J. Manafort, and Mr. Manafort's former business associate Rick Gates were indicted on Monday. The men were charged with 12 counts related to money laundering, tax evasion, and foreign lobbying. We read through the 31-page indictment. Here are the highlights. Lobbying and offshore accounts. According to the special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates worked as unregistered agents providing political consulting and lobbying work in Ukraine between at least 2006 and 2015. The men worked in various capacities with Viktor F. Yanukovych, the one-time Ukrainian president and a pro-Russia politician. The job was lucrative, generating tens of millions of dollars that the men attempted to hide from American tax collectors and the public in a series of foreign companies and bank accounts, the indictment said. Mr. Mueller's team found that more than $75 million passed through offshore accounts, and that Mr. Manafort laundered more than $18 million to pay for real estate, luxury goods and other services in the United States. Mr. Gates transferred more than $3 million from offshore accounts, court documents show. Lying about work in Ukraine. Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates were legally required to report their work for and payment from the Ukrainians to the United States. They did not, the documents show. After their work was disclosed in news reports in August 2016, when Mr. Manafort was still working for the Trump campaign, he and Mr. Gates developed a false and misleading cover story to distance themselves from Ukraine, according to federal prosecutors. The reports prompted the Justice Department to ask the men if they had ever worked as agents of a foreign power. They repeatedly said no, lying to federal agents, according to the indictment. No word of collusion, for now conspicuously absent from the charging documents against Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates. Any mention of campaign-related interaction between the two men and Russia or between the Trump campaign and Russia. American spy agencies have concluded that Russia acted to help Mr. Trump's candidacy during the election, and part of Mr. Mueller's task is to investigate whether the campaign coordinated with them. However, in a separate case on Monday, a foreign policy advisor to Mr. Trump's campaign, George Papadopoulos, pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about a contact with a professor with ties to Kremlin officials. The plea represents the most explicit evidence connecting the Trump campaign to the Russian election efforts. A lavish spender. Mr. Manafort in particular appears not to have been shy about using the money, wiring payments for clothing, cars, real estate and other luxury items directly from the foreign accounts to vendors, prosecutors wrote. Between 2008 and 2014, Mr. Manafort spent $849,215 at a men's clothing store in New York, and between 2008 and 2012, an additional $520,440 at a clothing store in Beverly Hills. He spent $934,350 at an antique rugs store in Alexandria, Virginia, where Mr. Manafort owns a home. Between 2008 and 2010, in 2012 alone, Mr. Manafort spent about $225,000 on 3 Range Rovers and a Mercedes-Benz. And between 2008 and 2014, he poured money into a home in the Hamptons. Documents show Mr. Manafort paid a home improvement company on the Long Island enclave $5.4 million during that time and paid 2 landscaping firms $800,000. No transactions was too small for prosecutors. Mr. Mueller's team appears to have examined Mr. Manafort's financial transactions, and no dealing was too small. In one case, in 2012, they found Mr. Manafort, though an LLC, paid $3 million in cash for a Brooklyn brownstone. Mr. Manafort then took out a $5 million loan for construction to convert the property into a single-family home. Instead of using the loan only for construction, though, documents show Mr. Manafort used the funds to pay off the mortgage on another apartment and make a down payment on another property in California.